In this video, I want to talk about the first aorist indicative paradigm. And we're going to look at the paradigm. We're going to look at the first aorist active paradigm, the first aorist middle paradigm. And with the aorist, we have a distinct middle and passive. So in another video, we'll look at the first aorist passive forms. But here we're only going to focus on the active and the middle. We want to distinguish the first aorist from the second aorist, which you've already learned a little bit. And when we talk about the first aorist, what we're really referring to are regular verbs. And so most of the verbs that we encounter are going to be first aorist verbs. They're going to be regular verbs. And so a lot of the verbs that you've already learned, though, are irregular. And so the pattern verb that you're going to learn for the regular pattern is going to be luo. So we're going to think about luo as we work through our first aorist indicative paradigms. Our aorist paradigm is really keyed off of our secondary endings, and in this quadrant it's on the right side. And so here we have our imperfect active and imperfect middle passive forms. So eluan, elus, eluen, eluamen, eluete, eluan. And then the middle passive eluamen, eluu, elueto, eta, eluamatha, eluestha, eluanta. And so these are our imperfect forms. The aorist is going to look very similar to the imperfect. And so our active form is going to be based off of the imperfect active endings eluan, elus, eluen, eluamen, eluete, eluan. And so with the first aorist, instead of the connecting vowel, we're going to get the tense formative sigma alpha. And so our imperfect eluan, elus, eluen, eluamen, eluete, eluan, with our aorist becomes elusa, elusas, elusin, elusamen, elusate, elusan. And so here on the left side of the slide, we get our connecting vowels. And when we shift to the aorist, instead of the connecting vowel, we get the tense formative sigma alpha. So elusa, elusas, elusin, elusamen, elusate, elusan. And note here that the endings are very similar to what we see in the imperfect. Here in our 3S, we get the movable nu. And then in our first person singular, that nu drops off, can't stay on its end. So we get no ending here with the first person singular. So eluan, elus, eluen. Our aorist is elusa, elusas, elusin. And then the plural eluamen, eluete, eluan. And then the aorist plural elusamen, elusate, elusan. So pretty straightforward, very similar to the imperfect. We get the augment, the tense stem, our tense formative sigma alpha, and then our endings. The middle passive, just like the active, is going to be based off the imperfect middle passive. And I said the aorist middle passive. This is the aorist middle. We're going to have a distinct aorist passive. So when you parse an aorist middle verb, it's got to be middle. When you parse an imperfect verb, it could be middle or passive. So these are our middle passives: eluamen, eluu, elueta, eluamatha, eluestha, eluanta. And so our aorist is based off of this. And just like with the active, we're going to replace our connecting vowels that we see in the imperfect form. We're going to replace it with sigma alpha. And our 2S form is unique. We'll talk more about this form here on the next slide. But here, just note that instead of that connecting vowel, we get our augment, the tense stem, the tense formative, sigma alpha, and then the endings are very similar. So main, o, ta, metha, estha, unta. So elu, samen, eluso, elusata, elusamatha, elusastha, elusanta. So pretty straightforward, pretty easy paradigm to memorize, particularly if you know that imperfect form. And so our second person singular form, what's going on here? Well, actually, we have our augment, our tense stem. We get this sigma alpha, and the ending is actually sigma omicron. And what we have here is what we call an intervocalic sigma. And so this means that we get our sigma coming in between two vowels. And so in Greek, when you have an intervocalic sigma, you have the sigma dropping out. And so the ending becomes sigma alpha omicron. And our alpha and omicron contract to omega. And so this is normal contraction. If we were to go back and review the contraction chart that we saw when we looked at contract verbs, we would see that alpha and omicron would shift to the omega. So this is how we get our form eluso. And so you can memorize these rules, memorize the ending, and memorize the rule, or you can just memorize the paradigm. I would recommend that you just memorize the paradigm eluso. Well, I need to delete our markings here. I would just recommend that you memorize the paradigm here: elusamain, eluso, elusata, elusamata, elusasta, elusanta. And I think you'll be in good shape. Just some odds and ends to talk about in terms of our first aorist. Here are liquid aorists, and we've seen liquid futures. These are the same kind of thing. These are where we have a liquid at the end of our third principal part, and our liquids are going to be mu, nu, lambda, or rho, and these are letters that have no natural stop. So if you pronounce them, the only way they stop is you run out of breath. So l, and so these are liquid futures, and so very similar to what we see in the first aorist. Instead of sa sin, samen sa te san, that sigma drops off, and so a as in amen ate on. And you just have to memorize the liquid. You just got to be able to identify that you're dealing with a liquid verb, and that's really going to help you deal with these aorist verbs. And ultimately, where we're headed is recognition. And note here, this is minnow, and so our stem, or I'm sorry, our lexical form is min o. And so note here we have a stem change, and so that ought to tell you that you're dealing with an aorist as well. And so just make sure that you look out for these liquid futures, aorist, liquid aorists. And this is the main slide that you really need to think about. You guys have already learned second aorist verbs, and so this first aorist. And so our second aorist verbs, we are going to look very similar to our imperfect. So our imperfect form of luo is eluan, elus, eluin, eluamen, eluete, eluan. Our second aorist are going to look very similar to our imperfect form, except we have the third principal part throughout instead of our first principal part. And so the lexical form for eleban, for example, is lambano. And so the imperfect form of lambano is going to be elamban, non. And so the way that you distinguish the imperfect from the aorist when you're dealing with second aorist verbs is we look at those stems. And so kind of an interesting way to do that. Now, when we're dealing with first aorist verbs, we get that sigma alpha. And so the stems remains the same, but we get the sigma alpha tense formative, which tells you you're dealing with the aorist. And don't forget the augment. And so in terms of grammar, both elusa and elaban They both articulate the same kind of action. It's undefined. It's in the past. The only difference between elusa and elaban is how the word is formed. And so really kind of an important aspect to think through as you work through our aorist form. So how do you tell the difference between a first aorist and second aorist? Well, you just have to know the principal parts. And so this is why knowing your principal parts is so key. And so here are some of the principal parts for some of our main verbs. So luo, no stem change. This is a regular verb. So luo, our future form is luso. And then our aorist is our third principal part, elusa. And so even though we can talk about principal parts with luo, the stem never changes. With balo, we get the stem change. And so our present is going to be balo with 2 lambdas. Our future is balo with 1 lambda. It's a liquid, so we get the circumflex here. And then et balan with 1 lambda. And so our imperfect form for balo is going to be based off of our first principal part with the augment the connecting vowel and the ending. So e balon. So very similar to the aorist. The only difference is this double lambda is going to tell me that I'm dealing with the imperfect. And so here's luo. Our imperfect is e luan. And then our second principal part is future luso. Third principal part, e lusa. Our fourth principal part is our perfect active, le luka. Our fifth principal part is perfect middle passive, le lumai. And then our sixth principal part, which is our future and aorist passive, is eluthane. Here's lego. Our imperfect is elegan. And then our future is ero. And then the aorist is apen. So this is a good example of a second aorist verb. Here's erkamai. Erkamai is our present tense. Erkamein is our imperfect. Our future is elusamai. And then the aorist is elthen. And we see it as eltha as well, but elthen is the main way that you'll see that form. Here's orao, which means I see. There's no imperfect form. Our future form is opsamai, and then our aorist is edan. Genomai, which means I become. Genomain is our imperfect. Gen etsomai is our future. Genomain is going to be our aorist. And so kind of an interesting verb here. Note here, in all of our non-present tense forms, kind of had that stem gamma epsilon nu. Here in the perfect, we have gamma omicron nu. And then in our present, we have gamma iota nu. So it's really kind of a regular verb outside of the present. But since we had the verb stem change, this is technically a second aorist verb. And so note here that our imperfect and our aorist, the only difference is that one vowel tells you that you're dealing with the imperfect and distinguishes it from the aorist. Here's gnosko, which means I know. So gnoskan is our imperfect. Gnosamai is our future, I'm sorry. Gnon is going to be our aorist. And so again, just like genomai, note here we get that gamma nu. That's the stem that runs throughout this verb paradigm, but it's very different than the stem that we see in the present. So the present tense seems to be the irregular form here. And then note here that the gamma nu, words in Greek that have a gamma nu beginning kind of map to our English words that begin with kn, like ni or knowledge. And so this is I know. So kind of an interesting derivation of the word here. So kind of help you memorize the vocabulary for gnosko. Here's minnow, and we've seen minnow here. Our imperfect is menon, and then our future is minnow with the circumflex. This is a liquid future. Et mena, me meneka. Here's balo, et balon with two lambdas. That's our imperfect. And then our future is balo. Again, it's a liquid future, so we get the circumflex. And then et balon is our aorist with one lambda. Note here that the perfect stem is ble. So it goes from ball with one lambda to ble. So almost kind of an inversion of the vowel and the lambda. And so bebleka, beblemai, and then eblethane is our aorist passive.